The children 12 and under that would like to go back to Children's Church are dismissed at this time. Now, next week, in case you hadn't noticed, we're pushing pretty fast into the holiday season, believe it or not. So next week, I'm going to take a little break from our study of the Beatitudes in order to focus on Thanksgiving because we're getting there. But this week, I want to continue on looking at, again, the first one of these blessings that Jesus delivered in his Sermon on the Mount, which was Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, where he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," which, again, just a refresher from the first week, what that meant there was totally destitute in themselves for anything spiritual, that we look to God for everything. And this is the first beatitude that Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount, and he said, "Blessed are they, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And I told you that I was going to spend a little more time on this particular beatitude because of the seriousness of the topic of pride, how universal it can be and how harmful it is to the spiritual life of the believer. And really, when we think about the issue of pride, I don't believe, or I don't think that most of the time we truly realize or recognize all of the various ways that it manifests itself. So, for example, the first week, I talked about the seriousness of, like I said, pride itself, spiritually speaking, very high level and very generic. Last week, we talked about how pride can mask our sin. I have a question. Am I coming across too loud? It sounds kind of loud up here to me. Is it? You're doing fine? Okay. All right. Just wanted to make sure. So last week, we talked about how pride can mask our sin, the thing that is keeping us separated from God, and how in so doing, it can keep us in bondage to sin. So, for example, last week we had the rich young ruler, and his pride masked his lust for his wealth, for materialism. I talked about myself last week. What my pride masked for me was my hatred, my bitterness that I had towards someone. But this week, I want to speak on another way that pride can harm a believer, because whereas last week, again, the rich young ruler from our text, at the very least, we can give him credit that he understood that something was missing from his life, and he was willing to seek out the Lord and ask Christ what it was, so he at least went to do that. Many other times, we are just perfectly content in allowing our pride to blind us altogether, where we have no desire for truth. Nothing in us that wants to ask that question to begin with, because our lack of humility can, and many times does, lead us to believe that we are just a little too perfect, spiritually speaking. That we don't need the grace of God because we've done nothing wrong. And so with that being said, I want to get into my two texts that I'm going to use for this week, and I want the first text that I'm going to read is going to come out of 2 Samuel chapter 12, and just to give a little background of what's going on in this story here, King David, who was a great king of Israel, and the Bible actually describes him as a man after God's own heart, he messed up, and he messed up big time. The Bible tells us that he saw a married woman bathing on a roof, that he lusted after her, that he found out that the man who was her husband was actually in his military, and yet he still went and he took this woman, he committed adultery with her. She gets pregnant. For this reason, he wants to cover up his sin, so he tries to bring Uriah, which is Bathsheba's husband, home, but Uriah refuses to go to be with his wife because of everything that's going on out in the battlefield for Israel. He's much more righteous in this instance than David. And so David, in trying to conceal his sin so that it doesn't get out what he's done, he actually has Uriah murdered by sending him back with his own death warrant that he should be in the front of the line. And so he is murdered. And so David thinks that he's gotten away with this sin. He's not repented of it. He's just forgotten that he's done this. And so I want to read a story of a prophet that God sent to David. And again, that comes out of 2 Samuel chapter 12. I'm going to read verses 1 through 7, and then I'm going to skip over to verse 13. And this is what it says. It says, "The Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, 'There were 2 men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. And the rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little lamb, which he had bought and raised. It grew up together with him and with his children. And it ate of his own food, drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was like a daughter to him. And a traveler came to the rich man, and he didn't want to take of his own flock and of his own herd to prepare for the wayfaring man who had come to him, but took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him.'" So he's telling him this story as if this is something that actually happened. And so like he's coming to the king, asking the king to do something in regards to this. And so verse 5 says, "David's anger burned hot against the man. And he said to Nathan, 'As the Lord lives, the man who has done this thing deserves to die. He must restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity.' And Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. You're the one that I'm talking about.'" He used this parable to get him to understand the wickedness that he had done. And so if we skip over to verse 13, David responds and he says to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Now I just have 3 more verses that I want to read because I, again, want to focus on David's response to his sin finally being called out to him. And so if we skip over to Psalm 51, we know that David wrote quite a large portion of the Psalms. And actually, if you look at above the Psalm before verse 1, it gives you a little description as to what David is saying here in this Psalm. He says, "For the chief musician, a psalm by David, when Nathan the prophet came to him after he had gone in to Bathsheba." So in other words, this was a psalm that he wrote, a song in response to his sin finally being called out. I'm just going to read the first 3 verses, and it says, "Have mercy on me, God, according to your loving kindness. According to the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is constantly before me." Now, David was an interesting man. You know, for a guy who showed no restraint whatsoever in his actions toward Bathsheba and her husband Uriah, he actually shows phenomenal restraint here when he's confronted by Nathan. So much restraint that he does a very public psalm that we still read to this day. And restraint, believe it or not, is a product of humility. That's why I talked about and why I've mentioned and I'm spending so much time on this first beatitude, because we don't recognize how much pride and humility actually control our lives depending on which one we choose. Proverbs chapter 25, verse 28, speaking on restraint, says, "Like a city that is broken down and without walls is a man whose spirit is without restraint." And I want to speak briefly this morning on the topic of how well we as Christians receive instruction, correction, and or criticism, and how much restraint or humility we actually have when the Lord sends someone to call out our sins. But before I do so, I want to start by asking each of us to first ask ourselves 3 questions. I'm not asking for answers. I'm just asking you to look inside and ask yourself this question. And I want us to answer these questions to ourselves, not in how we desire to be, or even in how we think we might be, but I want us to honestly examine ourselves today and to seek an answer in truth. Because there is no such thing as a version of truth. That's another sermon for another day. But there is truth or there isn't truth. And according to the Bible, there is. Jesus is truth. And so we need to ask ourselves these questions in truth and not hide like David was hiding. And all of these questions are related to whether or not we are poor in spirit, like Jesus said. Humble, or if we are full of pride and if we look to ourselves and if we hide things that we do. And the first question that I want you to ask yourself today is this: am I a teachable person? And the second question that I want you to ask yourself is, do I recognize that I need to be taught in the first place? And the final question that I want you to ask yourself is this: am I even approachable in order to be taught? Now, there are two main characters in the story from our text this morning. And the first one, of course, is the prophet Nathan. I'm going to start with him. The text tells us that God sent Nathan to David. So he had a mandate to go and speak to David about this. And actually, this story in itself, in just these brief scriptures, really tells us a lot about the character of Nathan. Because this was not an easy task for Nathan to do, nor did Nathan have a stress-free job as a prophet in those days. You see, being a prophet of the Lord, he would have to be able to exhibit some form of boldness. So there's the first part of his character there. Because in case you haven't noticed, most of the time, the message of the prophets in the Bible was a hard pill for people to swallow. And that was because, again, most of the time, God was using them to try to correct the people once they had strayed away from a true relationship with Him and they had fallen into sin. So in the Old Testament, we see a pattern of things happening, of prophets being treated pretty harshly, many of them being murdered. The prophet Isaiah, it's not specifically written in the Bible, but according to history, one of the kings of Judah actually had him sawn in half because of what he was saying. And so knowing this, we could say that Nathan was bold and that he was also brave. But in this case in particular, we truly do get to see just how courageous the prophet Nathan actually is in speaking to King David about his sin concerning his adultery and then the subsequent murder that he committed, because the method that Nathan used in telling the king this parable first, in order to get him to understand just how wicked the man from his story was, and arousing David's anger against this other man, only to then kind of drop a bomb right on top of the king's head by saying, David, you are the man that I'm talking about. It's you that has done this. Well, to me, that goes beyond courageous, because for one, Nathan already knew what David had done to Uriah and having him murdered in order to cover up his adultery to begin with. So that means that Nathan knew what David was capable of doing. And really, logically speaking, I want us to think about this. We know that any man in a position of power like David who would go ahead and kill someone in order to conceal his original sin was certainly capable of killing again in order to keep this sin concealed. And in fact, I would say in most cases, the odds are even probable that someone who did this would actually kill again. And so Nathan had to know this, and so he was certainly carrying the banner of God's truth very bravely towards what could have been his own demise in telling David the truth. So again, Nathan's character, if we were to look at it, he was bold and he was courageous. He clinged to truth. He believed that there was a truth. And these are all very good qualities, but they're actually not all. And the truth is, the point of this is not to talk about Nathan today, and although we're going to get back to his character in a few minutes, because we're actually not done with all of his qualities that he had before doing this. But even though I do want all of us, the point of this is to get us to identify with one of the characters in today's story. I don't want us to view ourselves as Nathan today. In fact, I'm going to be so bold as to say that in Christianity today, in general, there are too many people who think that they are a Nathan. And that's actually a problem, because far too often we do just that. We kind of view ourselves like we have a duty to correct everybody else, and we see ourselves as crusaders of truth, bold and courageous, like Nathan, stopping only at those first few characteristics that I've given you, and that we need to expose every flaw of every David that we come across, which of course is everyone else. And I do want to say up front that there is a purpose and there is a truth to the role of Nathan that is essential. It's very necessary. I'm not going to tell you that God doesn't send them, because we do need people like Nathan to come and to tell us when we're doing things. As sure as I'm standing here, he still uses those type of people today. But there is a process that needs to take place first before we can do something like that. Like, for one, our own hearts need to be right. That's another characteristic of Nathan, which we're going to get back to later. But I just want to be very blunt here. Many Christians out in the world today are disqualified from being able to do that, because Jesus talked about this himself, and basically what he said was that we were disqualified because, again, most of the time we need a Nathan to come to us. And so you see, there are many things that we need to have in order in our own life before we ever consider offering correction to somebody else. But again, that's a sermon for another day, which also deals with restraint and humility, but in a different manner. But instead today, I said I want us to identify with the other character from this story that many of us, myself included, actually do resemble, at least resemble him towards the beginning of the story. And that character is King David. And with what I just said, I'm not saying that we've all done horrible things like King David, that we've committed adultery and then murder to try and cover it up. But I am saying that many times, because of pride, we do view ourselves as so holy or so up here that we kind of ignore the blatant sins in our lives, and we think that God is just okay with them because we were the ones that committed them. That was David's problem. He knew that the Lord had put him in place. He thought, oh, the Lord will just excuse this, and he ignored it, and he moved on until it was brought to his attention. In fact, I'm going to pick on myself here for just a moment. I like to give myself as an example because I have many flaws and have. But for the vast majority of my life, if I were to look back on my time before I believe I got saved, I viewed myself more as a Nathan, when I certainly looked far more like David in regard to sin. Even when I was not truly following the Lord. There was a time where I would have told you that I was a Christian, but I was definitely not following the Lord. I certainly wasn't living right, and I wasn't doing things that were pleasing to the Lord. I still saw myself even then as a Nathan, and that's because of pride. And so whenever I saw a splinter in my neighbor's eye, like Jesus talked about, I would ignore the beam that's hanging out of my own eye, and I could kind of go on the attack and tell somebody their flaws. And here's the thing, and this is the problem, using myself as an example. When I would do this, it wasn't even done in a loving way intended to help the other person. It was done in a, hey, you're horrible for having this problem to begin with. And many times this is the approach that's used in the church, and that's really an indication that we ourselves need a Nathan, that we're not truly right with the Lord, or that we have a problem with pride ourselves. Now, I certainly did, and the funny part about me was I never understood why most people didn't like me when I behaved this way. And another interesting thing was that I had this feeling of moral superiority towards others. And with that also came this belief that any of my own transgressions, kind of like David, and there were many, I had many of those, they were no big deal, and that they certainly did not need to be brought up by somebody else because they were just excused because I was the one that was doing them. Now, that should sound hypocritical, but that's because it is. And that's what pride does to us, but it only gets worse. In fact, I felt that I was someone that needed to be respected. Somebody that should be looked up to. There's a lack of humility right there, but I still didn't see it. But I thought that I was this shining example, and so it was my way or the highway because I'm just that perfect. And so people should do what I say. And so no one else really had a right to point out my flaws. And if they did, I would just go straight on the attack to them. Well, here's another kind of spoiler alert to what I'm trying to say today. If we feel that way, again, this is a big indication that our heart is not right with God, that we've got a problem with pride. But yet this perfect man, the image that I kind of gave off of myself, and also what I made myself think in order to kind of console myself, because the truth of the matter was that I was actually a very lost, very broken and very hurting man, as we all are when we behave that way. But I was wounded trying to fill a void myself without God. But again, Jesus said that we can't look to ourselves for any of these things. And so refusing to even hear correction is a telltale sign of a seriously wounded person, somebody that's full of pride. So while correcting other people's flaws helped to kind of give me a feeling of moral superiority, I want you to see that receiving correction, on the other hand, felt like somebody was just kind of jabbing a stick in an open sore and causing me pain just to be mean. Now, I couldn't let anybody do that. I couldn't show any weakness. Well, again, that's another sign of pride. Basically, if I was expecting others to look up to me with the respect that I knew that I deserved, then I couldn't let them treat me that way. So if anyone even tried to talk to me about anything, big or small, whether it be spiritual or non-spiritual during this time, my blood would just boil. And if they wanted me to hear anything that they had to say, they better talk fast and they better talk loud, because I was going to come at them with an explosion of anger. And during this period of my life, I would scream at people, hang up on them, curse at them, you name it, I did it. But you know, it never occurred to me that what I was angry at them for in doing to me, I had absolutely no problem at all doing to them. So I had no issue confronting others in person, social media, wherever, and I expected them to listen to me. But I would not listen to them. I was hardly approachable. I was not teachable. And I did not think that I needed to be taught in the first place. There was not an ounce of humility there. And so on top of all of this, it should be no surprise to anyone that I was a very lonely person. My own lack of restraint, my inability to receive anything good had caused my city to fall. Like Proverbs 25:28, which I read to you earlier, like a city that is broken down and without walls is a man whose spirit is without restraint. And I had no respect because people could see right through me. But here's the ironic part about that. I was the one destroying my own city. That's what that proverb is trying to say. That's what Jesus is trying to say. But I didn't see it that way. And yet I would have carried on just like that, probably for the rest of my life, if it hadn't been for two things that happened. And the first thing was that God sent me a Nathan. And I do want to get back to Nathan again for just a brief minute, because you see, there was a reason that Nathan was successful in softening David's heart. Not anybody could have just gone and done this. And even though we aren't focusing on him specifically today, there are a couple of things that would be beneficial for us to understand about his role here. So again, let's further examine his character, which we already know shows boldness, it shows courage, it shows the importance of the truth. But again, as I said earlier, it didn't stop there. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is that Nathan and David, prior to this, already had a relationship built with each other. So there was a trust established in order to begin with. In fact, if we were to go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, we would see another conversation between Nathan and David concerning whether or not David should be the one to build the temple of God. David wanted to do this. Nathan's friendship with David at first, without consulting the Lord, just says, hey, go ahead and do this. But then the Lord speaks to Nathan later and says, no, you're not the one to build this temple, your son is. So they had this relationship. And then if we were to continue reading onward past today's text, we would see that that relationship between these two men continues on. So this confrontation about David's sin was not the end of this friendship. So you see, Nathan, what I want you to see, was loyal to David even in his correction of the king. And this had to do with David's heart in receiving the correction, as well as the trust that Nathan had built with him. Proverbs chapter 28, verse 23 says, one who rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than one who flatters him with the tongue. And that happened here. So to give proper context for what we're discussing today, I want to clarify that Nathan did not just show up out of the blue as a stranger to King David with this message from God in order to chastise the king and what he had done in a clearly confrontational manner only. And Nathan also was not an enemy. He didn't get a perverse pleasure out of confronting the king. In other words, Nathan did not enjoy hurting David. There was a pre-existing good relationship between these two men, and they were friends. And just for further clarification, David knew in advance, because of all of this, that Nathan was not out to get him. He knew that Nathan loved him. So the king's guard was down, and he was more willing to listen to someone that he knew would not intentionally try to hurt him. So Nathan, he had boldness in his character, he had courage, he had truth, but he also had faithfulness, and he had built trust, and most notably, he had love. A love for David. And that's another reason why I say many times in the church we're not necessarily qualified to do the correcting, because this takes a heart of genuine love that desires to see someone get better and to not hurt them or just to try and prove a point. And we almost never see correction happening that way. Yet it happened for David, and it happened for me in my story. I wouldn't be a preacher today without it. And I remember that moment very well for me, and also who that person was. In fact, I will say it was a pivotal moment in my own spiritual life, because for me, my Nathan was my best friend. He was a cousin of mine. He's since passed away. His name was Tracy. And again, that trust was not something that was built overnight. It didn't start at the point of correction. We already had a history. We had this relationship. Back in 2009, I moved out to New Mexico, was a corrections officer for a while. Tracy took me into his house. He treated me like I was his own son. He was actually 20 years older than I was. In fact, he went out of his way to be a faithful friend to me the entire time I was there. At one point, I remember I was having car trouble. My parents, nobody close to me was out there. And I remember Tracy handing me the keys to his car and telling me, use it for however long you need to. And then when I moved back to Ohio and I got married, he called me every single day, and he checked in on me to see how I was doing in every area of my life. He didn't do anything to try to hurt me, but everything to try to show me that his friendship and his love that he had for me was genuine. And I felt it. I knew that he loved me. In fact, he's been gone for almost 3 years now, and I still feel it. Still feel very close to him. I'll never forget that moment, though, that God used him to change my perspective on life and to open my eyes to myself, because, again, I was very blinded to what I was doing. And so I was talking to him on the phone one day. I had already moved back, and I was talking to him about life. I was talking to him about how I kind of felt persecuted by everyone else, how I felt like my family didn't appreciate me, they avoided me, they didn't invite me to certain things, how I thought my coworkers didn't even get along with me, and basically how I could trust nobody. And I gave him a bunch of examples to back up my feelings of why these people were just all terrible. And to me, they were great examples. And then I expected him to just kind of feed into my ego and my pride by agreeing with me. And I think many times that's what we think a real friend should do for us, as one that loves us should agree with us, or at least that's our mindset. But instead, his boldness and his courage and his faithfulness and his love gave me the truth. And I'll never forget this call, because he paused for a minute when I was sharing these things, and then he started speaking to me, and he gave me the example of someone else that we both knew. It was a member of our family. It was someone who we both already agreed together that she just didn't have a good personality. In fact, it was blatantly obvious to everyone this was a person who always thought she was right. She had to have everything her way. She had to have the last word, one that was certainly not approachable. She was not teachable. No one even really wanted to tolerate her anymore. She wasn't invited to family things. And then after he talked about her for a minute, he said something to me. He said, "Do you know what I said to her once when we were having this same conversation?" And I said, "What?" Because I wasn't expecting, I didn't know where we were going with this conversation. I didn't realize we were still talking about me. But he said to me, well, one time she and I were talking about why everyone else was so unfair to her. And so I looked at her and I asked her, what if the problem isn't with everybody else? Now that hurt. My best friend kind of pulled a Nathan on me, is what I'm trying to get you to see. The man I trusted, because he had built that trust. He gave me a parable. He got me to agree with him about the person in the parable and the type of personality that they had. And then he wrapped it all up by revealing to me who he was really talking about at that moment, which was me. You are the man. You are the one that you're agreeing with me that is in the wrong here. Now, again, this hurt. I mean, talk about wounding pride, about jabbing somebody where it's already sore, just like it hurt for David when Nathan did this. But he also did something that not too many others could have done for me at that moment. He got me to think, because I knew even still that he loved me, that he wasn't enjoying causing me pain in this regard. Now, I said earlier that I probably would have continued on in my unteachable, unapproachable manner for the rest of my life if it hadn't been for two things. And then I told you that first one was that God sent me my own Nathan, which was him, this rare person that he knew that I would at the very least listen to. But the second thing was this. I hung up the phone that day after we were done talking, and I felt that sting that comes from a wounded pride that none of us enjoy. And I clearly realized that I had a choice to make. I was blinded to the truth no more. So either I could do to Tracy what I'd done to everybody else and just reacting on emotion without restraint, stay in my pride. I could react from the anger, the pain inside of me, which really had nothing to do with him whatsoever. And I could lose yet another friend, a very loyal one that I considered my best friend. Or, for once in my life, I could humble myself, show some restraint, and like David finally did in this story, do some soul searching for the truth and recognize that at that moment I needed taught. See, I could come to the humbling realization that at that moment I am not Nathan. I'm not the one that needs to be teaching others. I'm not the one who has it all together spiritually and who has a God-given message to correct everybody else, but instead I am David. I'm a sinner. I'm full of pride, and so much so that I cannot even see my sin. I am the one who is messed up and who is hiding behind all of this, and I'm hurting others in the process. But I also am one who has a decision to make. I could recognize my sin, which is the real problem that has kept me unteachable and unapproachable, or I could continue on against the truth and refuse the correction. But you see, in verse 13 of 2 Samuel 12, right after being confronted, David shows us what we should do when he decides that it's time to stop hiding and time to start confessing. Nathan had taught him something valuable that day about being poor in spirit, and he knew it. So he restrained his pride and he allowed himself to be taught. And then after Nathan is done proclaiming the truth to him, that verse says that David says to Nathan, he doesn't argue with him. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. But he doesn't stop there. He doesn't just confess to Nathan, because then instead of continually looking for ways to try to protect his image further, because he was this great political leader which had all of this respect, instead of doing that, the king of Israel humbles himself totally, and he turns his repentance into a very public plea for forgiveness. Because he writes a psalm that goes in the psalm book of Israel. And he said in that psalm I read to you, he said, have mercy on me, God. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquities, confessing to God, but before everyone, cleanse me from my sin. You see, he was hiding no more. He had surrendered all of that pride. And what he was saying there was, Lord, I've messed up. I'm not this perfect man that I pretended to be. I see that now, and I acknowledge it, and I'm going to own it, so please change my heart. You see, through Nathan's correction, David became approachable and teachable again, because he understood that even as the mighty king of Israel, he could still make mistakes. And there were times where he still needed to be taught. There were also times that he needed the grace of God. And that's where I was in my life with my friend. And I thank God not only for that man, but also for when the truth was presented, that instead of being offended by it, I allowed myself to be taught by it. Because of the fact of the matter was, prior to that moment, I represented the definition of what the Bible calls a fool. But what I want all of us to understand is, more often than not, we do this quite a bit because we're prone to pride. Proverbs 29:11 says, a fool vents all of his anger, but a wise man brings himself under control. It goes back to restraint, which goes back to humility. You see, a wise man is teachable. A man after God's own heart actually desires to be taught the truth, because he recognizes that he can always learn no matter where he is in this life. And you know something? I want us to understand something here in closing, There's a lot of talk in the New Testament, and we read about spiritual growth and maturity, and I said when I came here that that's what I wanted to focus on, especially for the first year. But I don't think that the average Christian truly understands what actual Christian maturity is, because the church world as a whole tends to believe that spiritual growth and maturity come through knowledge only. Knowledge about doctrines and through studies of things like, for example, we could study the book of Revelation and try and understand it in the end times, and that gives us maturity. And that the more knowledge that we have on these things, the more mature we might be spiritually speaking. So we have all of these different things, and I'm not speaking against knowledge because those things certainly are important, and knowledge is important. But what I'm trying to say is that spiritual maturity does not come through figuring out whether you're pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib, or Wesleyan, or Armenian, or any of those things. Because you can read the Bible from cover to cover, and you can memorize chapter and verse, but yet you can still be a very spiritually immature person. Someone that nobody else can tolerate being around because of their lack of restraint and because of pride. You see, spiritual maturity comes through application and a willingness to let the Holy Spirit speak to us and to teach us in our heart and to say, hey, you know what? What I'm reading here, this does apply to me, not just my neighbor. This is something I will now change about myself, and I won't be ashamed to admit that I was wrong. Spiritual maturity comes through a recognition of truth that no matter how long I've been a Christian, there are going to be times when I do need instruction, I do need correction, and even constructive criticism from a bold, truthful, yet loving and faithful, trustworthy source. In fact, if we were to look in the Bible, it even happened to the apostles. There's a story in the Bible where the Apostle Paul had to correct the Apostle Peter, and if Paul had to correct somebody that walked with Jesus, then the rest of us should recognize that we're going to need corrected as well. So the question remains, how well do we receive that correction? Do we actually take the time to listen to what's being said and to see if it is accurate by comparing our own life to the Holy Scriptures, as King David did in this story? Or do we look more like Jason Jackson prior to his conversion and just react out of anger because we already know everything we need to know? Are we teachable people? Do we believe that there will be times when we need to be taught? And are we even approachable in the first place? If the answer was an automatic yes to any of those, then ask yourself again. But if the answer is no to any of those questions, then it's time to soften your heart like David to the Holy Spirit. So I'll close with Proverbs 13:13, which says this: whoever despises instruction will pay for it, but he who respects a command will be rewarded. That's why Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If you would bow your heads, let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, again, we just want to thank you for